So we'll go ahead and get going. I see everyone's still getting connected. Hello, hello.
Hello.
Did you turn this?
Um, Wonderful. So we are going to continue from our session last week. After the class last week where I got to join all of you, there was a request to continue the conversation and to focus more specifically on, hello, Ava, this is amazing. And hello, Robin, it's great to see you. There was a request last week to focus more specifically on BDS and on specifically like, what is BDS? Where does the movement come from? One of the things I find really interesting is that, just acknowledging that I am, significantly younger. I've lived through significantly less of the world history, and you all have much more collective experience about BDS and the movement and Zionism and Israel. And so what I was thinking about is what is the angle that I can share that I think is helpful. And the angle today that I want to look at is specifically what is the narrative that's being shared on largely college campuses, but also in liberal circles. What's the message that's being taught to our kids? What is the narrative that they are hearing? What is beguiling them? What is the story that the BDS movement is telling that is so entrancing our youth? And how can we share a story, a narrative, a truth about BDS that helps young adults to understand the real danger that it poses, not just to Israel, not just to the Jewish state, not just to the Jewish people, but specifically and importantly to Palestinians and to Arabs and to peace and to security and democracy? And how do we get that message across? So the texts that we're going to be looking at today are three texts. One is a video that's put together by Jewish Voices for Peace. And that is one of the groups that's super active on college campuses, that's promoting a BDS agenda. But I think also importantly, promoting a space that the young people are craving. And we'll look at that. We'll look at their video of how they explain the conflict and how they explain BDS. We're going to look at a curriculum that they put together as a way of teaching BDS. And we're going to think about what is that curriculum doing and how is it catching people? And all of that with the backdrop of Noah Tishby's chapter on BDS. And just so that I can have a sense, can I just see a show of hands for those who are showing their cameras? And even if you're not showing your cameras, if you want to use the Zoom features below, if I can just see a show of hands, how many folks were able to read the chapter by Noah Tishby in her book? Okay, so a strong minority, but we have a lot of friends who have not yet gotten that chance. So this is a really helpful framing for me. So I'm going to just start then with the Noah Tishby bit. And I just want to go through some of her arguments so that we're all on the same page, because I think it's just an important background for us as we are going to then look at these curriculum. So one of the things that Noah Tishby does is she starts by presenting what is BDS, and she quotes the definition of BDS that is on the official BDS website, which is that boycott, divestment, sanctions, BDS, is a Palestinian-led movement for freedom, justice, and equality. BDS upholds the simple principle that Palestinians are entitled to the same rights as the rest of humanity. As Noah Tishby points out, who could argue with this? This just feels like imminently true, like obviously who wants to stand opposed to human rights and the rights of humanity? And certainly all of us on this call want freedom and justice and equality. Then she goes through the more specific goals of the BDS movement. Goal number 1, ending Israel's occupation and the colonization of all Arab lands. As Noah Tishby points out, all Arab lands, that's as Hamas says, from the river to the sea. That's not just Arab lands in general, that's specifically all of Israel. Ending Israel's occupation and colonization of all Arab lands undermines the very principle that Israel can exist. This movement seeks to remove all Jewish people from the state of Israel, to remove the Jewish state, to create a world that it returns back to pre-1948. Goal number 2, getting Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel full equality. This is a complicated narrative, but quite simple actually, in the sense that Palestinians have been granted access to full rights and accessibility. There are challenges to that in that sometimes Palestinian government and or Hamas deliberately oppose Palestinians' rights to and access to economic freedom and freedoms and socioeconomic freedoms as a way to continue to use their people as bargaining chips. In all fairness, it's also, I feel like, important to acknowledge that there are still some inequalities that the Israeli government perpetuates, such as separate bus systems, such as separate access, such as separate trash collection. That all is a whole pot of stew. This one's a little complicated, but worth noting. And the third goal is promoting the rights of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes and properties. This one is tricky because they're not just speaking about the refugees that left 1948. This includes now up to like 6 million people because they count all children of refugees as refugees. It's a different distinction and a different way of counting refugees than any other refugee population in the world. Additionally, governments in Lebanon and Jordan have refused to allow Palestinian refugees to enter into society. They are also using the Palestinian people as bargaining chips. One of the things that the BDS movement does not acknowledge is the way in which other Arab governments choose to impoverish and subjugate Palestinian peoples as a way of perpetuating the conflict and as a way of continuing to have this bargaining chip. Noah Tishby goes through each and every point, talking about Gaza, talking about the security concerns, and talking about timing. One of the really important points she brings is a definition that was promoted by Natan Sharansky about how you determine what is legitimate criticism of Israel and what is actually anti-Semitic. And Natan Sharansky, if you're following along with me in the article, we're on page 205. A standard that is called the U.S. presidential, the 3D test: delegitimize, demonize, and double standard. In other words, if someone or an organization expresses a critical opinion of Israel, totally legit. But if that person who is expressing, or that organization expressing a critical opinion of Israel, is doing so in order to demonize or to delegitimize or to create a double standard, that is anti-Semitism. So I just want to read to you from Noah Tishby's section here. Here's our description of delegitimization. BDS flat out delegitimizes and denies Israel's right to exist. Not only does it reject the legal basis for the creation of the state by the UN, but it also denies that Israel is the historic homeland of the Jewish people. I'm realizing just now, give me just one moment. I'm going to pull this up so we can all be reading together. That will be a much better framework. Give me just one moment. Get this up so that everybody can be reading together. And I don't have to be the only reader, which is even better. 205. All right, perfect. Let me share this. And after this, I'm going to ask for volunteers. So if you're somebody that would like to read, I would love to invite you to join us. Okay. Can everyone see my screen? Okay, here we go. BDS delegitimizes and denies Israel's right to exist. Not only does it reject the legal basis for the creation of the state by the UN, but it also denies that Israel is the historic homeland of the Jewish people. When asked, BDS leaders expressly state that Israel indeed should not exist in its current iteration, as exemplified yet again by Tel Aviv University graduate and current PhD student Omar Barghouti. Quote, I am completely and categorically against binationalism because it assumes that there are two nations with equal moral claims to the land. Omar Barghouti, by the way, has been extremely influential and instrumental to promoting and perpetuating BDS narratives, particularly on college campuses. Is there somebody who might be willing to read the demonized section? Feel free to just, go ahead, Annette, thank you.
Demonize. BDS demonizes Israel and the Jews with constant descriptions of Israel as brutal, murderous, and guilty of premeditated ethnic cleansing, generally presenting the country as a warmongering monster. Again, what an irony when the Arab world has historically tried to eliminate Israel, and Israel is presently combating a terrorist organization aligned with Sharia law. Add to this the anti-Semitic slur posts and tweets expressed by its leaders and supporters, and BDS wins this one hands down.
Thank you, Annette. And if I could have one more volunteer to read the double standard.
I can volunteer. Maybe you can't see me. It's Esther.
Perfect, Esther. Thank you for reading.
Double standard. BDS proudly displays the mother of all double standards. As mentioned above, there is not a single word in all their well-manicured literature about Hamas, Sharia law, suicide attacks, elaborate attack tunnels, bombs attached to balloons and condoms, placing civilians under military bases, ammunition factories in Gaza, and so on. And don't even get me started on the BDS double standard toward the only consistent democracy in the Middle East, Israel, versus every single other country in the region. Israel is surrounded by some of the most vicious, theocratic, autocratic, dictatorial, oppressive Islamist regimes and a bunch of failed states, yet BDS singles only Israel out. BDS leadership does not care at all about the plight or human rights of Palestinians anywhere else in the world. If they did, they might work toward improving the horrifying conditions in overstuffed refugee camps in places like Lebanon, or on reforming the UNRWA, which enables Palestinians to stay refugees for 3 generations and counting.
Great.
Do you want me to continue?
That is perfect. No, we'll just stop there. Thank you so much, Esther. So this is really important. I'm gonna stop the screen share for a moment because it just feels important to dwell here for a moment. What's the difference between legitimate and illegitimate criticism? It's the goals, it's the objective. If your goal of your criticism is to create a better world, to create a better society, to create a better Israel, fine. We all want that. We all want to build a better world. But as she points out quite effectively, the goals of the BDS movement are not to create a safer, more secure Israel. The goals of the BDS movement are to destroy Israel, are to recreate Palestine where there are no Jews, and to build a world in which Jews are pushed out from their homeland and demonized and blamed. Now, I want to just pause here for a moment. She goes, I want to just mention one more thing, which is that she also goes through and she does a money trail discussion. It's worth reading the chapter if you haven't yet, which is about the way in which BDS is funded by Hamas and other terrorist organizations that are specifically and deliberately funneling money into the BDS movement and working to draw the BDS movement and align the BDS movement with other social justice organizations at the exclusion of Zionist and pro-Israel organizations. So, for example, the Black Lives Matter movement, BDS organizations infiltrated, joined with Women's March, joined with at the exclusion of pro-Israel protesters, and created a world in which those who support the state of Israel, those who support Jews, are not welcome at these kinds of rallies, and that creates real problems. It's a real intense PR war, and pro-Israel causes are losing in many, many college campuses. So I just want to pause here for reflections on the Noah Tishby piece of this conversation. What are your thoughts on her arguments, on her presentation of this material? Where are you now? And I'm noticing that we have a lot of screens that have gone black, and I want to just welcome everybody. If you want to turn your screen on, it would be such a joy to get to see your faces. Often in these Israel conversations, we all sort of exit the room. It shuts down conversation. It shuts down our ability to be present, and I would be really grateful if you would be willing to turn your screen on so we can be present together. So any thoughts on this initial piece from Noah Tishby? Go for it, Paul.
One of the things that's been omitted so far, and which I think really turns a lot of younger people, college students, off, is the way the West Bank is being handled. From what I've understood, Israel and other Arab countries have agreed somewhere that there should be 2 states. Now, Israel cannot control what Arab states do, but Israel can control what it does. And the West Bank allegedly is supposed to be part of a Palestinian state. And yet, Israel keeps building settlements and having checkpoints in the West Bank. And to young people, this is obvious harassment. I'm not saying it is. I'm saying young people feel that way, especially in college when they start thinking more internationally. So in some ways, if Israel's intention is to never give up the West Bank, that's one thing. But if they do intend to give up the West Bank, as they've agreed, I think they have agreed to do, then they have to somehow stop oppressing the Palestinians from the point of view of the young people. I'm not giving you my view. I'm just, because I have a lot of grandkids, and you hear different things. Yeah.
Well, and Paul, I want to augment what you're saying, because it's not only that Israel and Israeli settlements are creating a reality on the ground in the West Bank, which is true, that Israelis continually build settlements in areas that, if there were to be a 2-state solution, would be Palestinian land. And they build those areas and populate those neighborhoods so extensively that then reality on the ground becomes that they will have to be part of the Israeli state because there are 40,000, 50,000 people living in that city. Additionally, they also build specific roads that can only be accessed from settlement to settlement, and have built walls around surrounding Arab villages that sometimes cut off Arab farmers from their land. There are separate bus systems that Arabs and Palestinians use in the West Bank that Israeli settlers, Jewish settlers, do not use. If you are living in Israel, those buses are less nice. It's objectively 2 different realities. I think it's really important when we talk about BDS, when we talk about Israel, to acknowledge the injustices that are being done on the ground. We can't ignore that. That's real. That's true. That's one of the reasons I think Micha Goodman's book, Catch 67, is so important, because he acknowledges there are wrongs that are being done on the ground in the name of security, in the name of you name it. But we can shrink those wrongs. We can actively work on addressing those wrongs. My modest point here is that BDS is not the way to do that. And actually, BDS undermines the economic productivity, the economic opportunity of the very people it seeks to liberate. And that feels like an important distinction. So I'm with you. We have to acknowledge the injustices. You are absolutely right. The college students who are recognizing this are also right. And any student who's visiting Israel can go on these trips, can go and see these villages, can go and speak to the farmers. You can't argue with that. It's just the mode of how we work to help Israel with this. That's a question. Debbie.
I watched the CJP sponsored lecture last night with Noah Tishby, and the US legislators who are for the BDS movement, she claims it's not worth engaging with them because their minds are made up. You really cannot coax them to see another viewpoint. So we have Ayanna Pressley right from Massachusetts who's in that group. So what do we do about that? You know, we hear write your congressman. Well, I know where Markey and Warren are in Jake Auchincloss, but what about those people who are so pro BDS? That's a real problem.
I'm totally with you. And it's something that, you know, as a rabbi who works primarily with young people, with teenagers and young adults, it's a conversation I have often. And it's really hard. I will say it is very hard because the presentation is beguiling. The presentation is so seductive. And the challenge is, in order to figure out, in order to see the dark underbelly of the BDS movement, you have to really be thinking critically. You have to be really digging in order to uncover that. And that's not you know, we are trained, especially in the younger generation, we're trained like to fight for justice, to see the underdog, to lift up the oppressed. Like those are just what's happening all around us. And so the challenge is that thus far, I think that the pro-Israel movement, I think that the anti-BDS movement hasn't managed to latch on to a narrative, to a teaching tool that will help young people to hear what's really going on. And in the absence of that, we're going to continue to lose this PR battle. So what I want to do now is I want to share with you two things. One, I want to just take a look at there was a beautiful Daryl Horn piece that was just published that did not make it into our source sheet that was published today by Barry Weiss. And super important, one of the things that Daryl Horn shows is the wall at Harvard that she believes. Last week we were talking about that Crimson editorial about promoting BDS. And one of the things that Daryl Horn points out is that art sometimes creeps in, that popular messaging, that social media creeps in, and we don't think about it as critically. We're not thinking about it as critical information, and that shapes the way that we're able to hear information. So I just want to show you, this is a worthy piece. You should check it out. Let me see when everybody can see. All right, you should now be able to see my screen. Is that true? Great. So this is the wall that was at Harvard. And you'll notice that on the very far left, Zionism is racism, settler, colonialism, white supremacy, apartheid. This is what the BDS movement is fighting against. And interestingly, they go right out there and say they are against Zionism, against the Jewish ability to live, inhabit, and govern the state of Israel. They are seen as an extension of the colonial system. They align Israel with South African apartheid. Then we've got the highest attainable standard of health is one of the fundamental rights of every human being. You've got in the fourth panel, you see activists behind bars being shot up by police and their blood dripping down on the American flag. Again, that is, they're saying, a direct consequence of the Jewish state. Now, this is just inhabiting our water. What's interesting is that even Harvard students seeing this, even students who are theoretically intelligent, good at deciphering and understanding texts and understanding artwork and forming critical thought, don't see this. There's a way it just seeps in. So I'm going to pause this so that I can share a video. And this is a video from Jewish Voices for Peace, which is a pro-BDS organization that's active on many college campuses. It is a 6-minute film, and it's a short introduction to the conflict in Israel and Palestine. And what I want you to be watching for as we're going to look at this video is how do they explain the matzab, the situation that's in Israel, and how do they invite young people to participate? So I'm going to share this video. We'll watch it together and then we will discuss. Let me see if I can do this. I'm going to stop the share for one moment so I can modify the sound. So the sound will be appropriate because I realize I did not optimize for video clip and that will not make it as pleasant for you. Okay, here we go. Now I'm sharing for real. You can see my screen, right? Okay, here we go.
What would happen if you built a refuge for a persecuted people in a place where another people already lived? In the next few minutes, you'll learn why this moral quandary is at the root of the struggle between Israelis and Palestinians, and what you can do to help achieve a just peace for everyone in the region. First, there are a couple of things it's helpful to understand. One, many Jews fled harsh persecution in anti-Semitic Europe, especially the Nazi Holocaust. Zionists encouraged massive immigration to historic Palestine, at that time a British colony, where Jews had an age-old connection and where small Jewish communities had long existed among larger groups of indigenous peoples. But when the UN offered the Jewish immigrants the majority of the land for a new state called Israel, for the indigenous Palestinians who lived there, it was a massive destruction of life. They rejected the UN's partition plan, and several Arab states invaded the new state of Israel. Israeli forces essentially erased over 400 Palestinian villages and towns. By the end of the fighting, Israel controlled 78% of historic Palestine. And when 750,000 Palestinians who fled or were expelled during fighting tried to return to their homes where the new state now stood, they were permanently barred by the Israeli government. While over 100,000 of their relatives and neighbors who hadn't left became second-class citizens of the new state, along with the new Jewish majority. Today, Palestinian refugees and their descendants number in the millions. Most are in the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and Jordan. Many are spread throughout the world, with millions still living in refugee camps, seeking to return to their homeland. To sum up, one group of refugees found a much-needed home, but in the process, a new group of refugees was created. Here's the second thing to understand. Israel was founded as a Jewish state. But now ask yourself, what exactly does that mean? People had lots of ideas about what a Jewish state should look like. Some called for equality for all citizens. But what was created, in practice, was institutional discrimination against non-Jews. In other words, Israel ended up being built on a blueprint of exclusion. The Israeli government wants maximum land and resources for Jews, but not the Palestinians living there. That's why, inside Israel, Jews get special privileges, including rights to land and housing, that are denied to the Palestinian citizens, who make up 20% of Israel's population. That's also part of why Israel has never defined its borders. In fact, they still hold on to land, the West Bank and Gaza, that they conquered in the war in 1967. Since then, Israel has built Jewish settlements throughout the occupied West Bank, building Jewish-only cities and supplying them with infrastructure like roads and army camps, schools, and even a college. Military occupations are meant to be temporary, but after 40-plus years, this one looks permanent and entirely unjust. In the West Bank, Israeli Jewish settlers and Palestinians live on the same land, but must live under two completely separate and unequal systems of Israeli law. The Jewish settlers dominate the natural resources, including water and agricultural land, and they're backed by the Israeli army. To maintain the occupation, Israel has demolished thousands of Palestinian homes and orchards, confiscated Palestinian land, bombed a captive civilian population in Gaza, and punished resistance with raids, arrests, and assassinations, all to gain maximum land while making life so difficult for Palestinians that they will either leave or be too afraid to resist. Palestinians have fought back. For decades, they tried to achieve national liberation through armed struggle. Some groups still do. But the majority now support popular protest instead. The deeply harmful pattern of control, repression, and violence profoundly harms Palestinians living under occupation and Israelis living as occupiers. This must be broken to reach a peaceful and secure future for both peoples. Now that you understand the problem, what about the solution? What about peace talks? So far, over 2 decades of U.S.-backed peace talks have actually made things worse by helping Israel continue the occupation. It's been years of talking while Israel massively expanded the Jewish settlements and literally redrew the map. Peace talks are good if they're real, but not when they're theater to cover a land grab. So now what? The current world superpower, the United States, has been a terrible friend, enabling Israel's destructive and self-destructive expansion onto Palestinian land by funding the Israeli military, the biggest recipient of U.S. foreign aid in the world. But there's another superpower that can make the difference: you. There's a movement with hundreds of thousands of people just like you across the world, including Palestinians and Israelis, protesting, educating, divesting, and boycotting, all to bring nonviolent international pressure on Israel to stop violating human rights of Palestinians. Throughout history, where governments have failed to push for justice, people just like you, like us, have taken the lead and won. Now it's the Palestinians' turn for freedom and justice. We can pressure Israel to end the occupation and the discrimination. We want all people, Jews and Palestinians, to have equality, human rights, and democracy. We can change history. Join us.
All right. So I want to just invite some reflections on this video. What'd you think? Had you seen a Jewish Voices for Peace video before? So, welcome. Harry.
I was a little late and I just tuned in, but I think they did an amazing job of presenting their position. And the only thing I have to say briefly for the moment is that I had 2 grandsons at Vassar. I still have grandsons and they're graduated, but they're no longer in Vassar. And all I can say from my discussions with them, who have different personalities, which aren't important to go into, is that BDS was all over the campus with their view. And the opposing view was minimally dealt with. And I think that's pretty true of most of the college campuses. And I think now that age group is pretty much where the battle should be.
Totally. So Linda, I'm gonna invite us to come back because we're just looking at reflections of this video. Harry, what are your reflections on this video that we just saw?
There's so much that can be said, and I almost don't even know where to start. Just the title, Jewish Voice for Peace. Well, the Jews think this is wrong, so it must be wrong. If the Jews think Israel is wrong and shouldn't exist, then who can argue that it should exist, And it's interesting, when you explained their first premise, human rights for everybody, they don't say human rights for Israelis. Israelis don't have rights, The thing with the settlements, we're at a disadvantage because the situation is very complicated, and they make it seem like it's simple, it's black and white, it's easy, it's obvious. And our answer is no, it's complicated. Well, young people don't want to hear complicated. Just tell me who's right and who's wrong, and I'm for the underdog, and that's it. Settlements, political football. the whole settlement movement is a total failure. Most of the settlers live in and around Jerusalem. Ehud Barak offered the Arafat 97% of the West Bank because the vast majority of the settlements are on 3% of the land near the so-called Green Line. And he said, if I can keep that 3%, I'll give you 3% of Israel proper. Rejected it, because there's no place for Israel. Israel's a victim of geography. She's so tiny. People here don't realize how tiny Israel is. At Israel's widest, in the north of the Negev, where Israel is, it has the greatest width, that's the same distance as from Newton to Worcester. That's it. Where Israel's population lives is the distance from Cambridge to Newton. So and it's in the flat lowlands, very difficult to defend. And in fact, Kissinger said, and most young people don't know who Henry Kissinger was. He was in some history book, and that was at the time of the Civil War. Kissinger said Israel's borders are indefensible. That's why their doctrine was always the 6-Day War happened because Israel couldn't wait to be attacked. They didn't have the strategic depth. They didn't have the land. They couldn't absorb an attack. That's why they could only preempt. Ehud Barak, by the way, also offered to take back some of the refugees. Now, myself and my wife, we're refugees. I mean, I don't consider ourselves refugees anymore, but we came out of displaced persons camps in Europe. My children are not refugees, but by the Palestinian definition, you can call them refugees. You can call my grandchildren refugees. You can call my grandchildren's grandchildren down the road refugees by their definition. I think part of the problem is the Jewish groups. It's not a majority of Jews, but it's enough Jews who, whatever their motives are, I think they want to be accepted by the far left. They want to look like they're courageous. They want to look like they're the good Jews, and they get extra credits for this. They jump on this. For instance, the board from the Crimson at Harvard, the first thing they said was how courageous it was of them to do this. What great heroes they are. In other words, they patted themselves on the back first.
I'm with you.
They said, if you criticize Israel, you're going to get marginalized. You're going to be excluded. You're going to, be dealt with. You're going to pay the price. It's just the opposite. And, so, I think that their voices are louder. They have Jewish allies, even a small number, who are also very loud. And it's difficult to get the same kind of enthusiasm into our kids, and it's difficult on campuses to speak up. When I was
Harry, thank you.
I'm sorry. I don't want to monopolize.
You're good. I'm going to jump back in because I want to go back and focus on this video. I have other texts that I want to share with you that I think are really important. And I just want to highlight a couple of elements that came up for me in the video. And I really appreciate the way that you've highlighted those elements of how the video perpetuates a specific agenda. But I just want to be really clear. One of the things I think is so beguiling, right, is that childish font, is the cartoons, is the simplicity. Harry, you touched upon this beautifully. They present this as a simple, obvious truth. There's also a really important moment at the beginning of the film where the film acknowledges the Shoah, the Holocaust, and Jewish history. That, I believe, is a way that they can acknowledge. It seems like they are acknowledging history, but then if you go forward, they're omitting a very large portion of important Israeli history, important Jewish history. For example, notice at the very beginning of the film, they talk about Jewish people supplanting indigenous Palestinian people. Now that is pervasive. That's intense. How is it that Jews who have lived in the land for thousands of years are not indigenous people, but Palestinians are? Palestinians who conquered the land after Jews were already living there. How is it that Jews are not seen as indigenous peoples. That's really tricky and subversive, but important to note, important to point out. The other really important thing I want to highlight in this video is the focus on Jewish destruction of Palestinian communities rather than on Palestinian terrorism that erupted before 1948, that forced 1948, and that continued after 1948. The focus on real history in which Palestinian people didn't want to allow Jews to live in the land at all. And that is at the root of the conflict, really totally glossed over. And also, again, we talked about this earlier, but it bears repeating the repetition of Palestinian refugees in Jordan and Lebanon as if Israel is keeping them there rather than the Jordanian and Lebanese governments. There's also, you can go every single step of the video, the lack of resources in the West Bank, the lack of resources in Gaza, as if that's Israel creating that reality, and not those governments subjugating their own people for the purpose of perpetuating the conflict. Again, bombing captive people in Gaza, no mention of the rockets, no mention of the terrorism, no mention of the fact that Hamas stores rockets in nursery schools and hospitals and apartment buildings. There's just an absence of the other side. And our children watch these videos and they are just beguiled by the simplicity and the obvious truth. And the most powerful moment, right, is that after all of this history, we get to the moment where, America has let Israel down and every world power has let Israel down, but you can be the superpower. You have the power to fix this conflict if you just join with us. And that is something, right? Every young person wants to be part of the solution. Every young person wants to heal the world. Every young person wants to help the downtrodden. It's beguiling. So I want to take a moment, and I know we're running close on time. I want to take a moment to look with you at a curriculum that was produced by Jewish Voices for Peace's JVP about how they teach BDS. And I think it's super smart. We have some work to do in terms of getting to the place where we can respond, and not just respond, but we can recatch our young people's attention and refocus that attention on the issues and on supporting a Jewish state that also supports human rights and justice and equality. So I'm going to share this. This is, I believe you can all see my application now. I'm going to scroll up so you can see this is their Go and Learn Jewish Voices for Peace, facilitating discussion about the Palestinian call for BDS. If you scroll down to the first page, they have a lovely welcome about seeing who's in the room, about welcoming people. And then the first is a text study. That which is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow. That is the whole Torah. The rest is explanation. Go and learn. Now, Harry, I think your point about recognizing that if they feel like they have Jewish people, if this is a Jewish organization, if this is a Jewish presentation, here you go. This is a Jewish text. We're learning Jewish text, and they have this whole beautiful way of looking at if it's hateful to you. Excuse me one moment. Okay. If it's hateful for you, don't do it. How do we understand that connection between an all-encompassing ethical obligation and an imperative to go and learn? That's not actually why I wanted to show this to you. I'm just going to move this so I can see everybody. I'm going to reshare in a less optimal way so that I can see you all. Okay, here we go. Now I can see you while we're learning. The next thing that they do, and this is so interesting, they give out these stickers to participants. A green sticker means I feel good about this. I would participate in it and support it. Red, I do not feel good. Blue, I've been a part of this. And yellow, I have more questions. And then they paper the room with different boycott movements from throughout history. So they start with Nestle. Nestle was going into sub-Saharan African countries and impoverished countries and giving new mothers just enough free formula so that their milk would dry up. And then once their milk had dried up, even though they couldn't afford formula, even though they were mixing formula with disgusting water filled with microorganisms that were killing their babies and couldn't actually have enough money, that was a way that they were perpetuating their business. People boycotted Nestle. We as adult critical thinkers see this is totally not BDS, but they're lumping this along with all these others. Hyatt hotel boycott. So that the hotel will start being a better employer. The Treif, Matzah, and Berdichev. Here we go. We've got an 18th century boycott that was in order to figure out some better workers' rights. The kosher meat boycott of 1902. This is when famous pictures of Jewish women in New York were organizing to reduce the cost of kosher meat. Then we've got South Africa. Now this is a totally different boycott, but they're all lumped together. We've got the Montgomery bus boycott. We've got the ban on attending gladiator games from the Talmud as a way to oppose the cruelty of the sport. We have the Israeli cottage cheese boycott. This is the only one that I was actually present for. I lived there during the cottage cheese boycott. It was amazing. There was cottage cheese rotting on shelves, but the whole point was just to decrease the prices of cottage cheese. The Lysistrata sex boycott. Divestment from Darfur. Nazi boycott of Jewish businesses. That's it. So I just want to pause and look at this curriculum. You've got all of these boycotts for strict economic agendas, wanting to lower the price of cottage cheese, wanting to lower the price of kosher meat. Boycotts of the Hyatt Hotel, of the matzah factory in Berdichev, all of these movements that are seeking for workers' rights. Then you've got Darfur, South Africa, and BDS. So I just want to invite your thoughts as this curriculum to me, it's brilliant for moving forward the agenda and super problematic when you're looking at all of these movements as the same, when you're seeing all of these boycott movements as inherently equal, all seeking to promote justice, all seeking to promote human rights. How do you experience this? Had anyone seen this curriculum before? Had anyone engaged with these curriculum before? Because I want to share this because we have an important mission to do, which is we all feel this deep concern for our young people. But if this is the curriculum that they're seeing, and it's smart curriculum, I mean, this is curriculum that makes people feel seen and heard and gives them Jewish texts and Jewish discussion groups and their Jewish voices for peace, and they're going to fight for the equality. And here are all these boycott movements, and how do I feel about them? And it invites me to think, and I'm part of history. How do we work against that? So we have 10 minutes left in our class, and I want to spend the remaining 10 minutes responding to this curriculum and thinking together about how we can promote an educational curriculum that our young people will be attracted to, that will catch their attention, will represent history accurately, and which will help them to be critical thinkers in the face of the art that we saw at Harvard. That will help them to be critical thinkers in the face of this kind of curriculum, that will help them to be critical thinkers as they're engaging with Israel. So I want to invite your voices. What can we do, Maddie?
Where is this curriculum being distributed? This is the first time most of us are seeing this. Where is this being disseminated, and how widespread is it?
So nationally, probably internationally, though I don't have access to international curriculum. Jewish Voices for Peace is one of the organizations that's most active on U.S. college campuses that promotes a BDS agenda. That curriculum is being used. It was used, I have it from 2012. They've updated their curriculum since then. I just particularly liked that lesson. I was first exposed to it in rabbinical school when we were doing curriculum, and I was engaging with some rabbinical students who themselves were part of Jewish Voices for Peace, and for whom that was compelling Torah that helped them to understand the conflict. But that is, if, when students go to college fairs, when students go to sort of get involved on campus, one of the first things they'll see is like a Jewish Voices for Peace table. And they'll think that Jewish Voices for Peace, I mean, who could argue with Jewish Voices for Peace? And they'll bring them in, and then they start with these lessons, and they start with these educational opportunities. And gradually, students are inculcated and brought into this belief system. And it's really interesting. Part of, I think, what makes it so successful is it purports to be a space for inviting critical thinking about an issue that people don't think critically about. But as we see, it's very skewed. Any other thoughts, any other reflections on this curriculum and what we can do? Annette?
Well, I guess I'm not there yet, because for me, as I think for most of us, this is the first time we've seen it. And I think taking it in is a huge piece, because I think the power of what you've shown has really struck me. And my guess is to most people. I guess what I'd like to see is what is, and I'll use Hillel as the catch-all here. Why aren't they being successful? How are they failing? And again, I don't want to make it only Hillel, because I'm sure that's not the only group. But I don't know how else to capture that group. Jewish groups, I can use that word instead.
Camera, right-wing
okay.
pro-Israel organizations, APAC groups on campus.
Fine.
Yes. Why are
Okay.
these groups?
Why are they failing to meet this? Because I'm not sure I understand the mind all the time of the young people. I try to stay there, but I don't think I succeed. I feel like we've had one side this morning, which is incredibly helpful, but I'm not sure I can speak about what do we do. I just saw someone make a suggestion, which is a great suggestion, but we need to understand what's being done and what's failing.
Yeah, it's true. Rhiannon, I see your hand.
Hi, good morning, everybody. I am a Christian, I will let you know that. Talking about students and critical thinking, I think it should be noted that students are adults, they're young adults who are still children, and that their abilities of critical thinking have not yet been developed, and that hearing what essentially adds up to propaganda it's very difficult. If it's one-sided, they haven't yet been taught to be critical in their thinking, and so they're just absorbing one side.
Esther.
Yes, well, one question that I have is on page 20, after the postings of all the different boycotts. Why is the Nazi boycott of Jewish businesses here, which ends with the boycott marked the beginning of a nationwide campaign against the entire Jewish population? That's the one that most surprised me. Is that a way to look like they're being even-handed? I can't quite figure it out.
I think that's actually subliminal messaging there, because all of these, right, because the curriculum is specific to BDS, you're supposed to be able to map those boycotts onto the BDS movement in Israel. And I think that they're equating Israeli Jewish civilians with Nazis. and with the need to, we have to boycott, divest, sanction Israel because they are treating Arabs like Nazis. By the way, that's not just me being outrageous or coming up with something that's just to shock you. That is artwork that is coming out. If you read Darrell Horn's piece from this week, if you watch the, look at newspaper articles, that is a common trope. There are often cartoons of Nazi imagery of Arabs or Palestinians being taken in cattle cars towards crematorium with Israeli flags on them. That's a motif that happens often. And so I think all of those are deliberate mechanisms to equate Jewish people living in Israel with Nazis. It's horrible. Bruce.
I just wonder why, with all the bright people on college campuses, a course that refutes that with real history cannot be developed and presented to college students. I mean, I'm amazed as I listen to all of these things that Gaza, the return of Gaza is never mentioned, that the rise of terrorist groups is never mentioned, even the fact that after World War I, they were going to split up Saudi Arabia with the Jewish state, except that all these European countries wanted the oil. I mean, history is something that young people do not know. And I think that might be one thing to develop.
I'm with you. And I think also there are sometimes classes, but the classes that young people don't take. Esther.
Yes, one other thing I want to say is that this is really incredibly well done propaganda, as was the 6-minute film. And I do think the Jewish response has been tepid and too subtle and not dramatic enough. But the problem is that and most of us want to tell some version of the, what we consider the truth and the facts. And we can't produce a propaganda piece like this because they're dishonest, they're distorted and biased. And so that to me is one reason. And almost every single thing I read about Israel, the most pro-Israel stuff always has a line about we're not perfect, we make mistakes. The other side doesn't say things like that. So I view that as a real issue, but it's concerned me a lot that the Jewish community has not been as outspoken or as clever. I mean, as one speech I went to, a person said, it's unbelievable to think that the Jews have lost the PR war, but we are losing it. And wanting to be honest, wanting to show nuance, as Harry talked about, it's a complex situation. You're reducing it to simplistic messages here, but I think we have to find a better way. I find it all very distressing situation, but it's great that you're doing this class on it. Thank you.
Well, my joy. I want to say, I think when we're thinking about how to approach BDS, particularly with young people, it's really important for us to understand the messages that they are getting. And those are both the conscious messages that they are reading and the unconscious, subliminal messaging that they are seeing on their campuses in the form of those posters at Harvard or messages at the table for college activities. As we move forward, it's really important for us to do a couple of things I think that the Jewish Voices for Peace does really well. One being, it's really important for us to ask questions and to engage with, to make young people feel heard and to make them feel important and to make them feel that they have an important role to play in saving Israel and in helping to end the conflict. But that's a different role than supporting BDS, and that's a different role than supporting these organizations that seek to undermine the state of Israel. It's really important for us to acknowledge, I believe, the human rights violations that are happening in Israel. We can't win this by just claiming that Israel is justified in, Paul, as you mentioned, just continuing to put settlements on the ground, that Israel is justified in subjecting Palestinians to hours-long waits, to the injustice of trash collection and water supplies. I mean, we can't win by denying the injustices that are happening, but we can win by addressing the real examples, such as SodaStream, where BDS has actually worsened Palestinian lived experience rather than helping it. We have some serious work to do on our PR, but I think understanding and I think learning is the first step. We have to learn, we have to grow, and we have to recommit to helping to eradicate this voice and to helping our young people to support Israel, and to speaking up for what they believe in a way that also doesn't speak up for the end of the Jewish state. So thank you all so much. This is the end of our time for today. A joy to be with you. Debbie, I see your hand. So we're done with the class officially, but I would love to hear your voice. So feel free to share it. I can save it and we can hear it. We'd love to hear.
I just wanted to thank you. It's a very interesting session this week and last week. Thank you, Aliza.
Thank you so much. A joy to be with you. A joy to get to learn together.
Very enlightening.
Oh, thank you. Hope you all have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I wish
Thank
you
you
could
so much.
teach all
Thank
the
you.
young
This is
people.
actually the best
their
class I've ever heard.
I
to
tried
explain
to.
this.
I tried to, Mimi.
Thank you, Liza.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks so much. Have a great day, everyone.